Hello and welcome to our accounting section on ethics, doing the right thing. So, the thing about ethics is that in any accounting course you take, most any business course you take, you're going to see the discussion of ethics because it is an important topic to understand as you're going into the profession. So, when we talk about ethics, sometimes you bring up things like laws, morals. Ethics generally means the general way to define it is doing the right thing, decent human conduct. So we don't necessarily have a law for everything that's unethical, but it's all about what does society believes is right or wrong. So when we talk about ethics, unfortunately, a lot of things, you hear the end result of these massive accounting scandals, these massive failures. Sometimes you'll think, hey, that's obvious that that was unethical. And in many cases, it is. But a lot of times, those big scandals, those big frauds start from a small compromise of ethics and it just builds up. Someone asks you to do something that's just slightly wrong, just a little bit in violation of the rules. You do that, and then you do another thing, and another thing, and another thing, and at some point you find that it's very hard to reverse your course from. So that's the problem with ethics. It's often referred to as the slippery slope concept, where once you start going down that slope, it's very hard to get back on the high road. That's the thought behind that. Now, how do you tell whether something's ethical or unethical? If you're faced with a decision that's not very clear, there's no clear rule saying you can't do that, there's no clear law you're violating, how do you determine whether it's ethical or not? One rule of thumb is referred to as the newspaper concept. So imagine that your decision you're about to make is going to be published in the newspaper the next day, and all of your friends and family can see it. Is it something you would feel ashamed or embarrassed about if they knew about that? If so, perhaps it's an unethical type activity. Assuming we're talking about business activities here, if you would be embarrassed or ashamed, it may very well be unethical. So now let's say you're faced with an ethical decision. Maybe your manager is asking you to do something you're not quite sure is right. Again, maybe it's in violation of a clear rule, maybe it's not, but it's something that just doesn't feel right. Now, it's not always easy to do the right thing. That's the problem. Looking back after certain accounting scandals, some of them seem like they may have been easy in hindsight, but again, when it's a smaller level and you're not even 100% sure whether it's truly unethical or not, it's not easy to do the right thing. Even when it is a blatant ethical violation, it's still not all that easy to do the right thing because unfortunately there may very well be repercussions. It's a sad fact that a lot of times the people that end up bringing these scandals to light end up having a bad reputation for it, or they lose their job. They may have trouble finding jobs in the career field because of it. So they're often faced with the decision of, do I just continue to be a team player and go along with what everybody's doing, even though I have questions about it? Or do you bring it to light and blow the whistle, knowing that it's wrong, knowing that it should be stopped? Now, internal controls. We could have certainly a separate discussion talking about internal controls. These are controls that are put in place to try to prevent these things from happening. They range all the way from something like separation of duties, making sure more than two people handle a particular task so one person doesn't have too much power over that task. In other words, one person can't both perpetrate a crime and conceal it. So those internal controls all the way to things like passwords, authorization limits, things like that. We want to make sure that the activities are separated. We want to make sure that the accounting is controlled to make sure that, or to try to reduce or mitigate the risk of somebody being able to commit fraud. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, many of you may be familiar with something referred to as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. This was a piece of legislation passed by Congress early on in the century, and this was in response to a variety of accounting scandals that happened at the time related to very big companies such as Enron, WorldCom. A lot of other scandals happened around the same time. So the thought was pretty much every day, every week or so, you'd open up the newspaper, you'd hear more about another company, another scandal, another failure of internal controls. The market reacted pretty wildly to it. And the problem is, at some point, investors get to the point where they aren't even sure they can trust anybody, any company, even those that had previously been considered very strong, reputable companies. So they get to that point and they lose confidence in the market itself. They're less likely to invest. When investors stop investing, no company is able to get financing very easily. Even the reputable ones that are ethical, that are operating properly, they're going to have trouble getting capital to finance their operations, and the economy just starts to grind to a halt. Growth cannot occur in such a situation very easily. So without going into great detail, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act did a lot of things that seemed pretty obvious, but one of the big things was that it really strengthened the requirements of internal controls. It now requires the CPA to report on the internal controls, to review them to some extent, and issue an opinion on their effectiveness. There are a variety of different audits certain companies have to go through for the internal controls. And again, it increased the cost, but it also increases the benefit of those internal controls. Again, there are a variety of other things Sarbanes-Oxley did, a lot of them related to the auditing side, which are outside of the scope of this particular lecture. But it's important to note that when we talk about ethics, Sarbanes-Oxley is a very big component of that. So when we talk about ethics, we also often talk about corporate social responsibility. So we're talking about a company that should be a good corporate citizen. So how are they a good corporate citizen? You think of a corporation going after profits. That's their main goal. But to be a good corporate citizen, you have to balance that with other important items. Environmental sustainability. So if you think about it, you don't want to just pollute the environment to go the cheapest route. You want to take a look at other options to try to reduce the pollution that you're outputting while still being able to be profitable. You also want to take a look at, if you use, for example, if you use wood, let's say, so you have to clear timberland to produce your product. That's not very sustainable unless you plant new trees. If you don't plant new trees, eventually you're going to run out, and the whole idea behind sustainability is being able to do this for future years. You don't want to deplete your natural resources and have nothing to come back to use. Energy conservation, same kind of concept as pollution. Find ways to conserve energy in your operations. It may not be the most cost effective, but you may be able to find ways to make it a little bit more cost effective. And then generally, overall, avoiding actions that harm the community that you operate in. If you think about it, your employees come from that community. Many of your customers come from that community. So it just makes sense when you're being a good corporate citizen to try to protect that community as well. And that takes us to the end of our discussion on ethics for this lecture. Hopefully this has helped to clarify some of the concepts and terms you may see in your accounting courses.